Hey there, psych students. Professor Zeeb here, and welcome to another quick lecture on the contributions to the stress response. So we're going to look at some research that revolves around some of the contributions to stress and ways that we can kind of limit that. All right. So as we look at this, it turns out that there are psychological and social factors that profoundly influence stress physiology. In other words, research has identified different components of psychology and sociology that seem to explain why our body reacts the way it does to stress and things that influence that, and maybe even ways to sort of limit it to a certain extent. So to kind of explain this, we're going to look at some animal research that the textbook cites here. It's a really interesting study, actually. And so we go to Africa for this one, where they did some research with baboons in Kenya. So they studied these baboons. Now, to kind of understand this, you have to understand the social life of a baboon. I don't know if you've ever thought about a social life of a baboon, but anyway, we're going to look at that. And baboons are really interesting animals, and it turns out that they have this really rigid uh, hierarchy or pecking order, if you will, in their society. In other words, there will be individuals towards the top of the stratum, and typically these are the biggest, baddest males, probably some of the biggest animals, the fiercest ones. And then there's a series of different steps down to the most subordinate animals as well. So the way it works is that the dominant animals in that society have access to food. They have the best access to food or sexual partners. They have the best resting spots, as the book notes. They often bully the subordinates at times, for in terms of being competitive and being aggressive with them. So the social life is very different depending on where you fall as a baboon in that hierarchy, if that makes sense. So what they did is, knowing this going in, they studied these stress chemicals and bodies of these baboons in these social structures, if you would, and they found some interesting stuff here. Okay, so let's just kind of hit the highlights here of that research. So they found that the subordinate animals in that society secrete an excess of CRF. Remember, that's the cortisol releasing factor, which is related to releasing cortisol in the body by the Okay, so the CRF by the hypothalamus and had a diminished sensitivity of the pituitary gland. So remember, going into this from our previous information is that chronic cortisol, the stress hormone cortisol, chronic cortisol damages the brain. It damages the hippocampus, which is involved in shutting off the stress response. So these subordinate animals, the ones that are probably, getting bullied a lot and really the low end of that society, if you would, uh, probably are showing this because they're the ones that are most stressed out in that society. Like I said, they're being bullied. They're not getting access to all the good food, for example, and other reasons that we've mentioned. So you could argue that these subordinate animals are continually secreting cortisol, for example, because they're stressed out more, right? They have a rougher life in that society being on the bottom, unfortunately. And so as a result, they may have become less sensitive to it. Because remember, over time, it damages the hippocampus and it does not allow them to actually turn it off. And so therefore they're being succumbed to all that physical demand that stress places on their body. So in essence, their body is becoming less effective at stopping the stress response, and it becomes a little bit more dangerous for these animals that are at the bottom. In looking at the immune system of the animals that were at the bottom of the ladder, the subordinates had fewer circulating lymphocytes. So those are, related to white blood cells, if you would. And so that shows evidence of their immune system becoming compromised or being suppressed, which, as we've mentioned before, that it can lead to, problems with health. So their immune systems are not as strong as, say, the dominant males because of this difference. and thus their immune system is becoming more suppressed. Now, looking at the dominant baboons, the ones at the top of the rungs of the ladder, if you would, dominance seemed to be combined with stability and control and prediction, by the way, predictability, produced the most optimal stress hormone profiles. So when they looked at the stress profiles of each animal, they found that the alpha males, the ones at the top, had the best profiles. And so one of the reasons that is because their life is obviously a lot easier because they may not have as many competitors, for example, or their life is a little bit more predictable and controlling compared to the subordinate animals in that society. So, in other words, the dominant males with the fewest competitors, by the way, had the best profiles. So, what that's basically showing, and to relate it to humans is why we're talking about this, is that when our lives become very predictable, stable, and we view it as being in control, stress doesn't seem to be as big of a deal. In other words, it doesn't affect us as much because we feel like we're in control and we got this, and it's not, it's going to bounce off us because we have these strategies. So once again, we often find that people who really feel in control and feel stability and predictability in their lives are often the ones that fare the best when it comes to stress. So we're seeing a lot of that in the human research as well, not just obviously baboons. Okay, so that seems to be important, is having a sense of control and stability. I think maybe this is one of the reasons why traffic stresses us out so much. I don't know about you. I get really stressed out over traffic, and it's because I can't control traffic at all to a certain extent, right? It's keeping me from getting what I want, getting to where I want to go, but I cannot control it. It's sort of out of our control being in a car stuck in traffic, and that really seems to stress people out. So, once again, predictability, stability, and control seem to be really important factors that influence how we react to stress at different times. All right, so that's where we're going to stop here for this short lecture. So please move on to the next step in the class.